I always think, and this is probably a very unpopular thing to say, that all film writers should be shot. We do not need a text-based cinema, we need an image-based cinema. It says in the Old Testament, in the beginning was the Word. Sorry, that's wrong. In the beginning was the image.
Let's start with the beginning. Walthamstow School of Art. You studied art there. What prompted or inspired you to move into film?
If I can give you a glib answer, an Italian journalist asked me several weeks ago, why is it, Mr. Greenaway, you started your career as a painter and now you are a filmmaker? And I very quickly said I was always disappointed that paintings didn't have soundtracks.
Okay,
we all have definitions, don't we, of what cinema should be, what it ought to be, what it should have been, how it should have, organized its perspectives differently. I don't know. I suppose there are many ways to define cinema, as there are people in this audience. But I do feel, very disenchanted about the cinema we've now got. But I think, there's no good moaning and complaining. We have to do something about it. Rather like Mr. Eisenstein did in 1931.
And we're going to come on to Eisenstein a little later. I read one story that you were an avid fan of The Seventh Seal and watched it something like 10 times over the course of 1 week.
That's right. I've even got my own 35mm copy of it, but I don't have a 35mm projector.
So holding it up actually becomes a very long film.
It helps.
Just stay with your relationship with cinema, let's say what we would call conventional cinema, mainstream cinema. As you were studying art, was your desire to make films was it a reaction to that landscape?
Well, when I went to art school, I had no idea at all that I would possibly end up as a filmmaker. There was nothing particularly in my family background that suggested, indeed, that I should be interested in any sort of visual language. But I come from a family of people who have a great interest in natural history. My father was a very good but amateur ornithologist. My grandfather was a rose grower. My great-grandfather looked after deer in Epping Forest. These people weren't, by any means moneyed and didn't have particular book knowledge, but they had a great sort of observational excitement about the natural world. And I, of course, picked it up by osmosis, hardly directly. And I was always rather concerned about the sort of ephemerality of the natural world. And I thought at the tender age of 13 or 14 that maybe if I were to become a draftsman or to become a painter, I could somehow fix this. I could sort of establish it and give it a sense of permanence. And I rather suspect, though I have to be careful because this is all intellectual hindsight here, maybe I'm inventing too much, but there is a way that I think those are the beginnings of why indeed I wanted to be a painter indeed.
And what about the influence of literature? Because to watch the early short films that you made is to see the influence of writers like Italo Calvino and Borges, but you've also said at the same time, if you want to write for film, become a novelist.
Yes, I always think, and this is probably a very unpopular thing to say, that all film writers should be shot. We do not need a text-based cinema, we need an image-based cinema. It says in the Old Testament, in the beginning was the Word. Sorry, that's wrong. In the beginning was the image. And, and I think, cinema understands this, I suppose, this quandary, because it always, always, always goes back to the bookshop for its content. Obvious example, Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, but everybody else from Almodovar to Godard to Eisenstein, we have created a cinema where a producer has to be satisfied with a text first before he will give you the money. I think that's, rather unfortunate. it wasn't necessarily the ambition of all those French and Belgian apologists in the 1910s and 1920s, people like Bazin, for example, who said the cinema was really no more than an unsatisfactory combination of the theater literature, and if you're very lucky, one or two paintings. Because there is a way, you know, I'm sure you would agree, or we can find an argument that says we have a text-based cinema. Every single film you've ever seen starts life with a text. And text has so many opportunities, you know, for 8,000 years we've had lyric poetry, for 400 years we've had the novel. Theater hands its meaning down in text. Let's find a medium whose total sole responsibility is the world as seen as a form of visual intelligence. And surely, surely, surely the cinema should be that phenomenon.
The BFI a couple of years ago released 2 volumes of your early work, and you wrote an essay inside. And the opening of one of the essays, you write, "There's a body of work from 1963 to 1980 that precedes the Draughtsman's Contract, my first true narrative feature film, that gives evidence of a painter thinking he could possibly be a filmmaker." Now, having watched these films over the course of the last month or so, some of them again, some of them for the first time, it's very interesting because I don't look at it as an aspiring filmmaker or someone sort of on that journey. I see this the work of a bona fide filmmaker who is employing montage to a fantastic degree, experimental degree. But it's interesting that you see yourself still on that journey when looking at those films.
Well, you're right. I make very, very artificially, very solidly made, self-consciously edited films. I think you can see that all the way through. Great concern about notions, indeed, of Eisenstein montage and the dynamic that exists between image following image following an image. And I sincerely believe that probably, certainly now in 2016, the king of cinema, the most potent manipulator is the editor. You might have said, what, 20, 30 years ago it was the cameraman, but basically now an editor can do anything with a picture. With the digital revolution, you can transmogrify, you can metamorphize any image into any other image. And so the power of the editor, it seems to me, is extraordinarily strong and getting stronger. But in a way, in the digital age, you know, maybe the most powerful sort of manipulators, gatekeepers, are indeed editors of any sort. The huge mass of material that's now available needs sorting out. It needs classifying. It needs collating. It needs to be put and shaped into some sort of formula. So I think the disciplines of an editor, whether indeed he's playing with pictures or music or indeed text, is very, very important. Again, if I may dare to mention so early in this combination, my great hero, Eisenstein. Eisenstein was a brilliant film editor, and I think it certainly shows.
It's interesting you say about the amount of the wealth of material that's out there. Shortly before he died, Arthur C. Clarke said the one thing he didn't think about with the coming of the internet was that there would be too much information. It strikes me that with your cinema, you love the idea of perhaps too much because it allows you to go in any direction.
Well, yes, and of course it is, or it can be, not only a backhanded compliment, but it can be a big criticism. You know, too much, Mr. Greenaway, too much, cool down, you know, find economy, find sort of other ways of operating. But, you know, the capacity for the human imagination to embrace this huge amount of material, I think is very, very valid and very legitimate, and very honorable and very creditable. Let's get out there and use this huge amount of material. I believe sincerely it makes for any sort of exciting art and certainly for exciting cinema.
Let's go back to your early days. I think you had work experience at the BFI which led to you working for the Orwellian-sounding Central Office of Information.
That is true.
The COI.
The British Politburo, yes.
Could you talk about your experiences on that and how that fed into the work that followed?
Well, you probably know the COI was sort of a continuation of the Crown Film Unit was responsible, I suppose, to oppose Goebbels for British propaganda for activities, very sensibly, very creditably, for the Second World War. But I think there was you know, it employed extraordinary people like Auden and Benjamin Britten and really high-class people not necessarily associated with cinema, but with all the arts. But when the war was over, there was a problem here. How do you justify this propaganda arm? And about that sort of time, Macmillan was breaking up the colonial empire of Great Britain and supporting all the television stations of the world, which were opening in Canada and Australia and certainly, well, all the other places, you name them. So the COI became responsible for providing, I suppose, you know, basic information to fulfill the high demands of all this new sort of television, which meant that a huge amount of material was being generated, magazine programs, most of it shot on 16mm, and most of it black and white, and most of it television structured. But for me, that was an extraordinary opportunity to cut huge amounts of material over and over and over and over again. And I did my duty as an assistant editor, sweeping the trims off the floor, and gradually, of course, was given more and more responsibilities and ultimately actually made films for the COI. But it was propaganda. It's propaganda, certainly. Okay, let's call it soft porn propaganda, if you like. We were in the business of, you know, advertising the Beatles and showing the world how brilliant Concorde was, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm pretty certain that I committed some really terrible sins in hindsight about proselytizing completely the wrong things. Not that I had those decisions to make, but I certainly followed them through. So it was a period of intense learning, and the ability indeed to make, should we say, good propaganda and bad propaganda. And let's face it, good propaganda makes good art. We might complain about Eisenstein being in the hands of Stalin to create notions of Soviet communism, but let's take Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. Isn't the Sistine Chapel an extraordinary piece of propaganda for Roman Catholicism?
Fair enough.
If you think about it, cinema really has been pursuing notions of realism for 120 years. What a waste of time. God has already made the world. Why are we trying and reproduce it? But that is the way, isn't it? But I mean, that could, in general terms, be described as what we've been doing with painting for at least maybe 2,000 or 3,000 years. All that extraordinary post-Renaissance painting, the desire to get it right, you know, to learn anatomy and perfect it, to understand the notions of portraiture and the glance, to be able to understand and perceive the world, to try and get a facsimile of what the world is like down as a representation. But, you know, it wasn't until probably what somebody like Monet around about 1861 said, to hell with all that. Let's play with the notions of painting for its own sake. After those experiments, of course, we entered the greatest century that painting has ever known, which, of course, begins, I suppose, with, I don't know, Mondrian and Kandinsky, and we're off into abstract expressionism, and to hell with the desire to make things real. And so the whole phenomenon, which was a huge, of course, revolution, which a lot of people have great difficulty dealing with, is this notion of the disappearance of figuration. Now what we have to do is to get rid of narrative in cinema.
So, in terms of your first narrative feature film, and throughout most of your, if not all of your narrative feature films, there is this sense of artificiality, that we're made aware that we are constantly watching a film. Working with actors for the first time, and working with actors since, how do you negotiate this artificial space with them, as opposed to the desire to embody the person they're playing?
Well, you know, and I know that actors are always the loose cannon. Very, very difficult to be able to control them completely in the way that you can organize a costume, or indeed an animal, or indeed a field of grass.
This is becoming very Hitchcockian in the conversation.
And I suppose, but then, you know, feature film cinema, fictional cinema without actors is very, very arid. Yeah. Just think of all the abstract films you've seen, and they're extremely boring, yes?
True.
So you've got to find some way of negotiating and making this all sort of work. Maybe my cinema was not the ideal sort of performance stage for actors. But on the other hand, apart, I think, from Alec Guinness, who refused to work with me, that was because of my religious opinions, there was a way that no other actor has refused to come and work with me again. So there are certain sorts of opportunities and possibilities that people would find very advantageous to them, and certainly to the film, in my cinema making practice. Because I remember, you know, there's a way that when I would create a composition and I want somebody's hand there and they dare to move it, you know, we stop and start again. You know, I want your hand there and it has to stay there, which of course can be, you know, very dictatorial, et cetera, but I'm interested in making compositions. I'm interested in making extremely well-wrought, balanced picture making. That doesn't mean to say it has to be classical. It can be, you know, Dionysian. It doesn't always have to be Apollonian. But there is this great concern to get you, the audience, to look at the goddamn picture. Don't get de-hooked by getting involved in all these other sorts of activities, one of which is performance.
And is the other camera movement?
Well, a lot of these movies, you know, we hardly ever move the camera. It's going back to that Italian again, you know, this is paintings with soundtracks. And on the whole, paintings don't move.
Dare I even bring up the idea of narrative? But it strikes me that this film is very much a deconstruction of the genre. It's essentially a murder mystery. In perhaps the same way that your previous film, The Falls, is a disaster movie. And that is pushing the definition of disaster movie quite far. I'm just curious about your desire to react against the precepts of genre and a reaction against mainstream cinema to sort of rebel.
That is true. I think that maybe ought to bring us on to this notion again. The COI, after all, you know, was meant to be a documentary unit, and in a documentary, you're supposed to tell the truth. I mean, what on earth is the truth? You know, if you take history, for example, there's no such thing as history. There's only historians. History is unvisitable. You cannot go back and check anything out. And since, you know, we don't even use visual information for history so very often, we base our examination of history on text. And we all know from Julius Caesar to Winston Churchill that all historians are liars. You know, the idea, you know, the famous, I suppose, most famous English history is Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, a great classic, beautifully written. But really, it's not really about the Roman Empire, it's really about the English Empire. And Gibbon was deliberately using the uses of history to say something to his fellow travelers at the particular time he was writing. And I think this sort of vested interest, nobody writes history, if you like, totally, in a sense, objectively. The idea is not to do that. And I think, you know, we always, again, let's mention Julius Caesar and mention Winston Churchill again. They're very good writers. They aren't necessarily good historians, which leads us, I don't know who said it, but essentially, you know, history is only a branch of literature. Write this large, what are the differences, in a sense, between documentary and feature film? And I think ever since those times, what I'm talking now about were early 1980s, we've seen this increase and increase and increase. I think it's very important that we should break the barriers down between these rather sort of neat journalistic sort of appreciations and not worry about these definitions anymore. I've always really objected, you know, the word documentary implies a document, but we're making something which is not supposed to be about text. So all the contradictions. But again, you know, all the best people are interested in contradictions, aren't they? That's what makes the world go around. So let's exploit those. About 2 years before we made the Draughtsman's contract, we made two films. One was called Act of God, which was about people who'd been struck by lightning and survived. And the other was called The Falls, which you've mentioned, which was a rambling history about, I suppose, the metamorphosis of people into birds. Now, they were obviously, supposedly regarded, that horrible word, as mockumentaries. Don't like that word, but you can understand what's meaning. But the strange thing was, although I was scrupulous about recording the people who'd been really struck by lightning and survived, and as far as I could ever make it, I mean, as truthful as possible, and nobody believed it. But The Falls, which was completely and absolutely a theatrical fiction, people were far more prepared to believe that. So the notion is, I suppose, you believe what you want to believe, despite the evidence. And this is, I suppose, an attitude that's followed through in a lot of my filmmaking. Draughtsman's Contract really is a sort of documentary about 1694, about the Married Woman's Property Act, about the way people wore costumes, about the antagonisms of Protestants against Catholics. It's almost a history lesson again. And it's also highly, highly color-coded. So it really is rather like a Whistler painting, a nocturne in blue, green, and yellow, whatever else. There are 3 colors there. It's basically green, white, and black. These formal concerns, which continually always excited me, are as much important for me in the manufacture of this movie as anything you might presuppose about notions of revenge tragedy or ideas of the thriller. And also, of course, in total, it's the story about a frame-up. And the frame is absolutely essential heretofore in the history of the cinema we've made so far.
We're going to move on 2 films to a film that you made in 1985. A film you made in 1987, The Belly of an Architect. This is the second film of yours that I saw. The first I saw in the cinema is an art house cinema in Wales. And there was a couple in front of me, and the guy was goading his girlfriend into going to see it. And his argument was, no, you'll love it. It's got the guy who plays the sheriff in the first Rambo film in it. I thought, she's going to be surprised.
No, it is strange. We made the film in Rome, and Brian Dennehy was constantly harassed by people who wanted his signature. Yeah.
I don't know why, but watching it recently, of the body of work that you produced, as you directed in the 1980s, this struck me as the most intimate and personal film that you made. Am I wrong in that, or?
No, but I don't want to, overload you with private indulgences. This is a portrait of my father, and there is a way in which there are many, many resonances which were relative to his life and represented by, indeed, the character that was played by Brian Dennehy. So it was a very, very personalized film, yes.
The other thing that struck me watching it again is the way that you look at the role of the architect and perhaps the most important or relevant artist in our everyday life. Would you agree? Or?
The major one, architecture is meant to be the first of all the arts, which shelters everything else. You're absolutely right, yes. Yep.
And just in terms of getting this film made, and prior to this you made a Zed Two Noughts, following it you made Drowning by Numbers. Was it easy to write? Because watching these films, they are a singular vision, and there are other filmmakers I've seen that, as I watch the films unfold, I think there's a lot of compromises here. But these films feel so uncompromising. As a result of the success of the Draughtsman's Contract, was it easy to get these films made?
No, the first film, in a curious way, it's easy to make the first film because nothing's gone before, and you can't judge anything by anything. But I mean, the films that follow that first success become more and more difficult because audiences expect you to make Son of Draughtsman's Contract and, Belly of an Architect Part 2. And I didn't want to do that at all. I wanted to, have certain pursuits, and I think the vocabulary is getting laid down in these first 3 films, but it needed to be tacked. I needed to tack in different directions. I wasn't going to go on making the same film over and over again. And I think, it's obviously important to be able, not only for myself, but for audiences to show there's development going on here.
And I know this is a subject we probably don't have enough time to go into in any great depth, but the concept of numeracy in your films. We've got the 12 drawings in Draughtsman's Contract, the 8 stages of Darwinian evolution in the Zed Two Noughts, not to mention the play with numbers in Drowning by Numbers.
Well, again, I think perhaps we've already touched on this. I am very, very doubtful about narrative in cinema. Because I don't think, if I were to ask any member of the audience here, tell me the story of the sinking of Titanic, tell me the story of Casablanca, okay, you would probably give me something in 2 or 3 seconds, maybe a few more seconds if you were particularly fascinated by these films, but you'd soon dry up because in a curious way, the story is not important. What we remember and what we are engaged in a particular cinematic experience is some amazing connection between happenstance, performance, maybe color coding, a piece of music, a particular thing that only cinema can reproduce. And that doesn't hang, I don't believe, that doesn't hang at all upon any desires for storytelling. Sequence, yes. Notions again of editing ideas about space and time, but narrativity, no. So I wonder why we all spend so much time and effort in creating a writer's cinema when we have no business doing it. And I sincerely believe if we got rid of that notion of being slaved to the bookshop, which we are, we really, I believe, have to cut that umbilical cord and allow cinema to run free away from the enslavement of narrative. Now, I know that's very difficult for a lot of people to understand because an awful lot of people deliberately go to cinema to be told a story. But I believe cinema is far more valuable than simply to be a vehicle for storytellers.
Let's jump forward to the late 1980s and for a film that, for many people, defined Britain in the 1980s. This is The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover. It's probably a good time to talk. You mentioned earlier about the role of editors today and saying in the past it was cinematographers. This is such a stunning example of your collaboration with Sacha Vierny, who you began working with on Zed Two Noughts and all the way through to 8.5 Women.
Yep.
Could you talk about your collaboration, the process, and particularly in terms of this film?
Well, Sacha Vierny, Russian by origin, living most of his life in Paris, had worked with mainly great cinematic hero of mine, who would be Helen Mirren, who made last year in Marion Bad, which I think is the greatest European movie ever made. And he'd also worked with Buñuel and lots of other, sort of post-Nouvelle Vague filmmakers like Rob Griet and Marguerite Duras and so on. So extremely well seasoned. I think he was an assistant way back before, indeed, the Second World War, and had worked on Testament d'Orphée by Cocteau. So his, his roots in French cinematic history were very, very profound. Extremely wise man, sometimes a little difficult to get on with, still a communist. He was always the one that cried havoc when people weren't being paid properly. Good for him. And indeed we did work on probably about 10 or 12 films, not necessarily always feature films. He had 1,000 tricks, all sorts of tricks which most people had forgotten. How to outline with white chalk the edges of all staircases so you could see them very clearly under conditions of low light. Great ideas about, how to distinguish vermilion from crimson with a light. Very, very quick on very, very small resources. We made a film called The Baby of Macon, and we took over a huge cathedral in Amsterdam, and he lit it with about 4 candles, and it worked. Extraordinary. In fact, he said, whilst you're lighting it, you can read the newspaper, but only take page 4, because I'm going to need page 2 as a reflector for the candles. So you could see also his wryness as well, but he followed it up. He really did deliver with, all his ideas and his theories. Unfortunately, he died about 10 years ago, but he educated, if you like, both me, myself, and also a brilliant Dutch cameraman who we've been working together now for about, I suppose, ever since he died, a man called Renier van Brummelen. I think that Sacha Vierny would have had a lot of problems with the digital revolution. He was a really dyed-in-the-wool sort of studio a cameraman, but we did do crazy things. Like we took artificial lights out into the real landscape and tried to compete with God's sun. Crazy, crazy ideas. Produced some rather fascinating ideas. You mentioned the film Zed Two Noughts. We actually drew up a list, 26, because it's all based on the alphabet, 26 different ways to light a set. Now that sounds rather dryly sort of academic, but it was good, and we fulfilled. We lit by dawn, by midnight, by candles, by cathode tubes, and I think we even lit by rainbows. We didn't manage to light by starlight. That's a bit difficult. Probably you can do it now, but you couldn't do it back in early 1980s. So he obviously had an academic turn of mind, and he was interested in language for its own sake. So I do believe we got on very well.
And did you talk a great deal about the actual coding of?
Yes, of course. I have to bring in the art department here as well. You know, the whole film is based on 7 colors. The kitchen is green because that's the jungle where all the food came from. The restaurant is red because it represents meat eating and cannibalism, and so on and so on. And we tread it all the way through. And just to make people very, very self-conscious that we were playing with colors here, Helen Mirren, when she walked through a door, she changed color like a chameleon with the circumstances and the scenario. So that was a sort of really interesting idea to pursue and fun to pursue.
Let's move on to, and in many ways, an even wilder, more daring experiment. I remember in 1990 watching on Channel 4 A TV Dante, and being surprised and confronted by what I thought was an absolutely remarkable piece of television. The following year, I think there was just a segment of Prospero's books screened at Cannes, and a lot of critics came away saying it was by far the best film that screened at Cannes that year. I think it's wonderful the way that John Gielgud threw himself into this. And my assumption was this was a project initiated by you, but he had much more involvement in that, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, Gielgud always reckoned that Shakespeare had written The Tempest for him. I mean, it's an incredibly wordy part, full of the most extraordinary, beautiful language. And, you know, we could say this, can't we, in the year 2016, when everybody's celebrating, indeed, celebrating, can you celebrate? Memorializing the death of Shakespeare. But would you not agree that most films about Shakespeare are normally done by actors who see a huge opportunity to put their performance on everlasting screen? You know, theatrical performances come and go and only exist in the memory. And, you know, you can think of a whole host of people, Laurence Olivier, et cetera, who did that. And I think that Gielgud always wanted to make a film of, indeed, Shakespeare's last play, The Tempest. And he was completely over the moon that we could find an opportunity to make it. And we did it in a particular way, insofar as Gielgud himself played all the parts. He voiced everybody. He even voiced Miranda, his daughter. And that was, in a sense, you know, there used to be a theory that, well, maybe it still exists in some people's minds, that The Tempest is Shakespeare's farewell to the theatre. So it was a summation of everything, I think, that Gielgud thought he'd done. So when you ask that question, because he wanted to do it so much, he gave everything.
And looking at the chronology of your films, you have this, then it's followed by The Baby of Macon, then we moved for Pillow Book. And it struck me watching these films in order again recently, of this desire to move away, to do something new. And then you look throughout the 1990s that you have your immense project, The Stairs, you work more in galleries, and it's almost a broadening of not necessarily your horizons, but the physical horizons of what you're actually physically doing.
Well, I became very disenchanted by cinema, and you can see intimations of how I feel about cinema now. I just didn't feel it was really satisfactorily understanding and developing its premises of the 1920s as a meta medium for extraordinary inroads and excitements, not in prose, but in poetry. And I don't know, I always felt very, I suppose, frustrated that I couldn't push it forward. And so the notion of cinema became part of a bigger world, and you're absolutely right. I began to explore all the other sort of, I made a couple of operas, I had a lot of painting shows, and we had a huge project about the vocabulary of cinema, which we made in big city exhibitions. One was in Geneva, one was in Trieste, one was in Munich. Really big sort of state products, costing a huge amount of money to make an examination, if you like, about the vocabulary of cinema from the outside. But these things, of course, could only be seen by limited audiences, and they were very much in situ. You had to be there. I got very excited about the notion of, what's the Latin phrase? It means, what does it mean? It means, you know, the sense of place. And I became very frustrated about places like this, you know, the falsity of the cinematic imagination and so on. I suppose that's why I started making operas, and we had, you know, operas in Verona, in the bars of Caracalla. So it was an attempt, I suppose, to, shall we say, use the reality of the world rather than its fictional representation in cinema. However, we made this huge project called the Talsluper Suitcases, really massive project, cost an awful lot of money. It was an enormous success in film festivals of the world. I think it went to over 300 film festivals, but it was an absolute failure in a cinema. And I think that was because we could see what was going to happen with the digital revolution. And I was somehow hoping, ridiculously, to embrace what we all take for granted now, so that there's a way that you, the audience, could intervene. You could stop, and you could start, and you could select. And if you were only interested in the color red, you could only just select the red shots. If you were only interested in the chase, you could just chase. If you didn't like to see people kissing, you could get rid of them. So there was a way, it was really massive interactive cinema. But the technology didn't exist, audiences weren't ready, and the total film in a public sense never made it.
But Talsluper is a fascinating character across the whole of your career. If you go back to the short films, A Walk Through H, Vertical Features remake, it appears in The Falls, and then we have the 3 features made a decade ago. What is it about this character? It seems too easy to just say it's the cinematic alter ego of Peter Greenaway.
Well, you have to say it, though. I mean,
I just said it. I can say it again.
That was, you know, obviously, but with a fictionalization of myself, I could travel to areas where I could never do it in real life. Yeah. You know, I had all sorts of exciting sexual adventures which had not been inside my experience, and all sorts of other, you know, activities of impossibility. So it was an extension, if you like, of what I thought, you know, the cinema maker, and I suppose being very exhibitionist and very, I suppose, léger majesty is where I posited myself. Maybe it's no accident that ever afterwards I've attempted, you know, with films about Vermeer, films about Goldsmith, films about Rembrandt, and now films about Eisenstein, to posit who this magnificent creature should be. Heaven forbid that it should even remotely be called Greenaway, but it was an example of searching for the real sort of mega possibilities of what the seventh art could have been.
Let's actually move on to Rembrandt and your 2007 film, Night Watching. My first viewing of this, my first reaction was it was some kind of riposte to Amadeus, where you have this genius who's a child, but that was full of affectation. What I found fascinating about this, and in a way it goes back to my fascination with Belly of an Architect, that you can hold the artist up high, but they are a human being, and rather than have high art, low art, you bring the levels down and move them up until you're just portraying a life.
You're right, and I think, again, since you're going to talk about Eisenstein before long,
we are.
It's the same situation again. I live in Amsterdam, and they're very pragmatic people, the Dutch. And I did a big series, and we're still working on it, called 9 Classic Paintings Revisited. And the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam allowed me to project on this painting. Now, this painting is uninsurable. Just after the Second World War, the Marshall Plan bailed Holland out of its terrible economic disasters after the Nazis had destroyed the country. And the Dutch were getting way behind in their interest payments, but the incumbent American president said, okay, Holland, we will forgive you. You don't have to pay any more money for what you owe us if you give us Rembrandt's The Night Watch. And they said, no way, absolutely no way. It's a very important painting because it's all about you know, the fight, the sort of David and Goliath against, you know, the powerful forces, indeed, of Germany during the Second World War. But I mean, there is a way that also the Dutch regard Rembrandt as the car mechanic up the road. You know, he's very good. His wife's extremely good with money and looks after him very well. And he knows, how to organize his canvas, etc. But he's like us, he shits in the toilet and, he has to sleep 8 hours at night. So it's a very pragmatic thing. And we've tried to do, always to have that sense of mortality, mortality, mortality. So these great ambitions, to expand and create meta cinema, I know they're doomed to fail. It's like, we're all making, massive attempts to organize the world, but it's hubris, isn't it? We are pushing, we're fighting the gods to do the impossible. It's important, we should do it though. We have to keep doing it. We have to keep doing it, but we know we're going to fail. And in a curious way, all these great geniuses are part and parcel of that same phenomenon, as indeed was Mr. Eisenstein.
And you keep doing it because thousands will be turning out in the UK this weekend to see Eisenstein in Guanajuato, your new film, which we're going to come on to. Between Night Watching and the new film, you made Goldtis and the Pelican Company, which is a continuation of a Dutch master's project. And I strongly recommend that people see that. It's a beautiful film. But let's move on to Eisenstein. Something that comes out of watching this film, and I see it in so much of your work, is a passion to share your passion and your knowledge. It's perhaps glib to say to educate people, but there is this sense that this is a great person, this is a great artist, please go and watch his work. These great painters, go and see these paintings. There's something beautiful about a passion sort of just glowing in a way off the screen.
Well, it is true. I don't say and talk about missionary positions, do I? Which is a bit of a problem. But there is these are extraordinary people who have, touched the top of the possibilities of our civilization. And they should be, I sincerely believe, looked at and learned from and revered. I hold the rather strange, maybe, position that I think the most important people in civilization of the world are painters. That might be rather strange for a lot of people who might think painting is a rather elitist private occupation, but painters create the man-made world. Let me tell you an anecdote. Giacometti, Italian-Swiss, said, and I don't wish to malign your grandmother, but your grandmother probably knows nothing about Picasso, but be absolutely certain that Picasso knows everything about your grandmother. The way that the trickle-down effect happens with the particular imaginations of people who visualize ideas in the world for the last 8,000 years, let's make it more convenient and go back to the Renaissance, is profound. And when we're talking about our grandmothers, your grandmother's probably got curtains in her kitchen, which has got a design on it, which is influenced by, I don't know, Joe Bloggs, and Joe Bloggs has looked at Utrillo, and Utrillo has looked at Picasso. So you can see how Picasso has influenced, in a curious way, your grandmother. I mean, everything absolutely in this room is designed, and the origin of all this design is painters. So painters have made the man-made world, and I think that's extraordinary, and I think painters ought to be highly applauded.
There's a painter in the audience. I don't want to come back to narrative, but I do want to talk about drama. And we can look at a Rothko painting, which has no narrative, but it has drama. It's interesting with the scenarios that we're presented with in your films. And in this case, scenario is probably the wrong word, the situations with your characters. In this case, Eisenstein in Mexico, that they are to some degree in a moment of crisis. And with particular reference to this film, I'm curious about Eisenstein and Mexico. What interested you, that moment in his life?
Well, without wishing to be, pompous in any way, the film is, of course, about Eros and Thanatos, sex and death. I really bore people to death by going on and on about this, but let me do it one more time. Everybody in the audience, your most important moments in your life is your very beginning and your very ending. Now, I don't really know very much I know about one or two people in the audience, but most of you I know nothing at all. But there are two factors. Two people fucked to make you, and I'm very sorry you're going to die. Everything else about your life is really very, very ephemeral, isn't it? And isn't that why all art is really about Eros and Thanatos? The very beginning, which is unknowable, and the very ending is also unknowable. So it's no surprise that all culture, all religion, all painting, all cinema is really basically about these things. And I think all my movies really have been about that. The subjects are infinite, and one could talk about them endlessly, endlessly, and they really are incredibly fascinating. Whether you're a serial killer or a nun, you are interested in sex. And we all know the immortality and the mortality principle, which is maybe why people make art in the first place. So with subject matters like that, there's no end to the permutations and the permutations and the permutations. And again, you know, there's a way that Eisenstein is about the self-same thing. He, of anybody, probably understood. He, even as a small boy, I think German doctors suggested he had a heart that wasn't going to last very long. He did die. I think he died aged about 50, so he didn't live very, very long. And he was always very much aware of his mortality. And I think on the other side, you know, he's very questionable about his own sexuality. He never really sort of could understand how he could operate emotionally and sexually. And indeed, as is exemplified in this film, he falls in love with a young man, his guide for Guanajuato. And the film has a subtitle. You probably know the film October, the big third feature film he made, was sometimes called 10 Days That Shook the World. So the subtitle of our film is 10 Days That Shook Eisenstein.
I think Sex and Death is a good moment to open up to the audience and see if they have any questions. So we have some roving mics. I don't know if the lights are going to go up, but if someone does have a question, wave your hand wildly. The man is waving his hand wildly there.
I don't know how to phrase this, but in Freud, you've got the superego, the ego and the id. Gaston Bachelard, Poetics of Space, you've got the attic, the place of dreams, and the ground floor, which is reality, where you might go out and get a package from the postman and connect with the real world, and the basement, which is kind of very dark and primitive and cavemanish. And I've always thought The Tempest was like Ariel is the place of dreams, if you like, and Prospero is very realistic and practical and active, and Caliban, of course, is the caveman unconscious. And I'd like to know how you perhaps express this in Prospero's books.
Yes. How long have we got? I mean, what is so amazing about Shakespeare that he fits any age, doesn't he? The whole, you know, the sort of anti-colonialism association that became a part and parcel of our understanding of Caliban. The actual suggestion, again, I think I mentioned it already, about this being Shakespeare's last play, and it's all about reconciliation. It's about the reconciliation, indeed, of these Freudian items that you have associated with your question. Eisenstein was fascinated by Freud, I think mainly because Eisenstein was devoted to Leonardo da Vinci, and you probably know that Freud wrote a paper on Leonardo da Vinci about a black bird flapping its tail in Leonardo da Vinci's wife, which doesn't have to be pursued too far to understand all sorts of homosexual associations. So he made that identification. But in the film, he actually suggests that Freud was very wise by suggesting that all of us need 5 phenomena in order to make us complete and happy. Let me see if I can remember them. First of all, we need our health. Without health, everything becomes null and void. Second, we need work. We are programmed to work. A man or a woman who does not work leaves an empty, fragile, sort of frigid sort of life. The third thing is, okay, although an awful lot of stupid people have got money, and we need a little sustenance to keep us going, we don't need a lot of money, but we need some money. Now, maybe this is a particular masculine thing, but item number 4 is we need sex. We are incredibly programmed for all sorts of sexual imperatives. And then lastly, if we're very lucky, we have love. Let's go through them again. Health, work, money, sex, love. And if you've got all those things and they're all manipulating and working their way through all the superegos and the ids and the egos that you're talking about, then surely we are profoundly happy. Unfortunately, Eisenstein wanted to meet Freud, but it didn't happen. He did meet his daughter, but he never met the man himself. I don't know whether that remotely offers you any sorts of answer, but it's an implication again, that polyglot, polymath Eisenstein was certainly aware of all the theories going around, and he's I suppose the big Californian concern for Freudian psychoanalysis is round about this time, the same time as indeed of the invention of sound cinema. And isn't it always interesting how Freud and cinema have gone along together? Cinema was invented by the Lumiere brothers, so-called, 3 days before Christmas in 1895. 6 days before Christmas, Freud wrote his first paper on female hysteria. Is there a connection? I bet you there's a connection there. I'll leave it to you to work out.
Or the next Peter Greenaway film. While we're passing the mic over to our gentleman, something about this film that a couple of years ago, the French writer Laurent Binet wrote the kind of novel biography, HHHH, which is about an actual event taking place in the Second World War. And some people were outraged by the fact that on one page he's recreating what happened with these two incredibly brave people. The next page he's talking about his current girlfriend. And then he talks about one of the characters, one of the real people in the Second World War, waking up in the morning, going down to get their grey coat and putting it on. He said, well, hold on a minute. How do I know they got it? How do I know it was raining outside? How do I know they went down to get their grey coat? There is this thing, and again, it comes back to this idea of naturalism. We can represent reality. The pleasure of watching this film is that it sort of does away with that straight away and just tells us we can't know exactly what they said at that moment in time.
Sure.
There's a pleasure in it, and yet it feels, oddly, that I got more from that than I would reading a biography of Eisenstein.
Well, it's only 120 minutes long.
That's true.
And, it's only 10 days, short part of his life. But there is a way that, we've known, haven't we, even after a miserable 120 years, that cinema is capable of doing this. Unfortunately, we see it so rarely. And it must be encouraged. And I think, that's, you are encapsulating all our hopes and ambitions for a cinema we ought to be having.
Yes. Down at the front.
Listening to you talk, I sense that you have a certain amount of disdain for modern cinema, generally. And I wondered what influences you and how much you do tune into other people's movies, and what influences you, and how even the feeling about being involved in BAFTA and the whole because you do to a certain extent have always sat outside the general realm of movie making.
I'm not a very good cinema spectator. I become very, very impatient very, very quickly. I don't know whether you're going to believe me, but the last time I actually went into a cinema, came to the box office, bought a ticket, sat down in the dark for 120 minutes and stayed there to the bitter end would be David Lynch's Blue Velvet. That's a long, long time ago. I still believe that film's an extraordinary film. But ever afterwards, I've always, had these impatiences. It's related, of course, to being a practicing filmmaker. I don't want to watch other people's films. I want to make my own film. But that's, that's a very understandable phenomenon, isn't it? And often, there's probably no film at all that goes by, however wretched it is, which doesn't have a few nanoseconds of something really extraordinary. Whether that's conscious or unconscious is another situation. But, maybe I'm very unforgiving. I'm looking for the perfect film. I'm looking for the film that would totally satisfy, like those 1910, 1920 Belgian and French apologists for cinema being this great art. I obviously have to know probably more about cinema than anybody in this audience. I'm a practicing filmmaker. I have to know about actors, I have to know about technologies, I have to know about mise en scène, etc. And I do watch an awful lot of cinema, but again, I suspect, rather like a lot of you, I see it in a very fragmentary way on smartphones and DVDs and television, where I have control. I don't know whether I've discussed this with you, but as I said, I think maybe I said, maybe I didn't say it, but let me say it again. At the risk of repeating myself, I believe that cinema died on the 31st of September 1983 when the zapper or the remote control was introduced into the living rooms of the world. Bang! Cinema ceases to be passive and becomes active. You, the audience, are now, in some senses, in control of the filmmaking process. You've all got mobile phones, you've all got camera recorders, and you've all got laptops. So you're all filmmakers. Now, unlike in 1983, from a distance on the sofa, you could probably basically turn the cinema on and you could turn the cinema off on your television set. Now you have all the tools for remaking Spielberg's Jurassic World. You can now remake that. We give you, Microsoft and his friends and relatives have given you the ways and means of doing that. So in a sense, you know, we have undercut some of the really important first-class characteristics of notions of what cinema was for our fathers and forefathers. Cinema, okay, sometimes still it's an event, but for most of us, cinema is not an event anymore. Very few of us, actually, proportionately, actually look at cinema en masse. Okay, maybe you're all good cinephiles, and maybe you do indeed come to BAFTA every third night of the week, and you see a film in company. Most people don't see films in company anymore, and they don't see them as events. They see them privately, either completely on their own, or with their nearest and dearest in the office, or in the sitting room. So these are big changes in the way we perceive and understand the notion of the cinema of our forefathers. I think filmmakers, and indeed audiences, have to acclimatize themselves to this and reorganize what we really regard as the cinema of the future, and as a consequence, make it so.
And are you, firstly in terms of your own output, but then within the wider landscape of cinema, are you hopeful about the future?
Well, if I complain or if I state that cinema is dying, and now dying very, very rapidly, I don't really think it's a cause for spilt milk or tears. Because as always, if you trace back, you know, there's something about the human psyche, isn't there, that needs this grand, spectacular phenomenon. And we've always had it. The ancient Greeks had extraordinary theaters. The Romans, people like Pompey, built the biggest theaters that the world has ever seen. And then the Roman Catholic Church took over and took the notion of spectacle into the church with all its full vocabulary. And I suppose then opera took over, and opera manifests that same satisfying excitement about audio-visual, sensational mise en scène. And then I suppose, you know, opera continued probably till 1918, last years of the First World War. More or less 1918, our film historians say that's when opera basically gave up and cinema took over. And now we've had 120 years of cinema. Maybe that's long enough. Now we're looking for the next huge super audio visual technology which will really empower and satisfy our contemporary imagination. And I think in a curious way we're all looking for it. I think that Eisenstein's first masterpiece, Strike, is really the beginning of cinema, the beginnings of cinema intelligence. Cinema was invented in 1895, Strike was made in about 1925. So it's taken 30 years, a long generation, before people understood the new vocabulary of cinema in order to consolidate it, synthesize it, bring it all together, and make the first consolidated masterpiece. If I think cinema died in 1983, we're about 30 years or so right now. Somebody maybe in the audience is the next person to make the cinematic strike or the post-cinematic strike for the 21st century. Please come on up and let's see it.
Thank you very much to BAFTA for organising this event, but most of all, can you please join me in thanking Peter Greenaway?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what you might call a strong role is actually a role that's full of weakness and vulnerabilities and ambivalence. Those are the best roles.
With a digital camera and a computer, you have the basic tools and you can do it. If you know what you're doing, you could theoretically touch the work.